What's up, crew? Welcome to Filming in Progress, the show that takes you backstage into the world of local businesses and the people who make them shine. Please welcome Sophie, co-founder of The Thoughtful Co. and Women in Consulting Engineering. She's a leader in gender equity, helping workplaces foster diversity and empower women to thrive. Sophie, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Tell me about how The Thoughtful Co. Was started.
Yeah, a little bit serendipitous in some ways. So my business partner, Jillian, and I, we both went to Western in London, Ontario. And she went to business school with my now husband and then her husband as well. And so when we all moved back to Vancouver, we would go on an annual hiking camping trip every year. And so she had a very different background. I was working in structural engineering. She was working in compensation. And we had always connected about women's experience in the workplace, but obviously we're working in very different industries. And so in, I guess, early or mid 2020, I had been thinking for a while, I had a bug in my ear. I wanted to do something else. I wanted to shift a little bit away from engineering, and I wanted to support that industry in building more inclusive spaces, but I just didn't know how to. I kind of was looking at jobs and seeing what was out there, but didn't really see anything that was the right fit. And so when she left her job in 2021, she was at Lululemon at the time, I reached out and I was like, what are you doing? Very curious. I knew she didn't have anything lined up right away. So the two of us went out for sushi, and she had, I think it was actually that morning, had created a website called The Thoughtful Co. And she was like, I don't know what this is yet, but this is my passion project right now. And it started initially as just a blog. We wrote articles about things we were passionate about equity, diversity, and inclusion, about the gender pay gap. And slowly over the next few months, so this would have been September 2021-ish, we started kind of crafting out what a core business would be and ultimately the path to launching. It's very serendipitous. We're both very risk averse, so we're always shocked that we're entrepreneurs.
I love that. It's super cool. You find that, the business idea comes before certainly the name.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's funny that we were like, oh, we still like that. That's a perfect fit, even though we didn't know what the business was yet.
Really cool. And where did the name come from originally? It was just a thought, or? Yeah,
so it was actually, I feel like we both really resonated with this concept, but it was Jill who came up with it first. Whereas I think she was feeling when she was in the corporate world, she was always rushed and she was always pushing things out the door because there was a deadline that she couldn't control, and felt that she didn't have the space to be thoughtful and intentional and deliver the highest quality work all of the time. And so she wanted a core of this new path to be always feeling really good about what we're delivering, having the time to do it, and being really thoughtful and intentional. So that's how it came to be.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Was there a moment throughout that, the blogging process that the two of you decided now, it can be a business and we're going to take it there?
Yeah, I think it was sort of throughout that fall, we started kind of crafting out some of our earlier core functions. So now what we do are kind of three business offerings are: one, we coach women in compensation negotiation. And so that's for performance reviews, promotions, new job offers. And then two, we advise employers in building more equitable and inclusive workplaces with a special focus on gender equity and in male-dominated industries, so engineering, construction, tech. And then the third piece is doing presentations and workshops for professional associations, organizations, and employers. And so that first piece, I was still working full-time as a structural engineer, and Jill started to kind of craft out an initial coaching structure for compensation negotiation. And so some of our early clients were like friends and family. It was a low rate just to get some testimonials, feel good about what we're offering and how we're structuring it. And so it was kind of maybe beginning of 2022 that we started feeling really good about the structure of how we would do that. And then we were trying to reach out more on the employer side. We'd crafted out what we wanted to do, but it definitely took longer to build that trust with employers than it did with individuals.
As things do.
Yeah, exactly.
Totally.
It takes some more time.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Did you anticipate when you decided to turn it into a business, did you anticipate that, like, the amount of demand that there would be for the service?
Yes and no. Like, I felt that there was something there. Like, I knew on the negotiation side that's something a lot of people don't talk about. They feel really uncomfortable with. But a big overhaul for us was no one, it's not a service that's readily out there. So we weren't trying to position ourselves as why pick us. It was, this is a service, education of something you could ask for, and then now why pick us. So, we felt that there was a big gap. We knew the gender pay gap was really big, but it was a big lift to be able to build that education. And then on the employer side, I had in 2018, I co-founded a nonprofit called Women in Consulting Engineering, or WCE. And through that work, we were a nonprofit, which is still in existence today, that builds inclusion for women in the engineering space. And so I sat as co-chair of that group for 3 years, and I met both a bunch of women in the industry who were feeling that they were maybe leaving firms they were at or the industry entirely because they weren't finding the right fit to be most successful and seeking it elsewhere. Whereas on the flip side, also meeting a lot of employers that were really trying to make change, maybe for the very first time, but didn't know where to start. And so I felt that there was a really big opportunity where the industry was asking those questions for the very first time, but they didn't have capacity or the resources to do it themselves. So I felt like there was something there, but yeah, it's scary to go out.
Definitely. Yeah, I feel like it's a topic that's obviously, well, maybe, I mean, you can shed some light to this, but everybody's aware it exists. There's no hiding that fact for sure. But I feel like maybe is there education? What is kind of the missing piece in regards to people taking that next step, and whether it be employing your services or taking action in other areas? What is that? Is it education that's missing?
Yeah, I think education is a part of it. Like, I find, especially when we're working with a new employer, there is such a range in terms of each individual's comfort and background education when we kick off. Typically, we are engaged by someone who has been thinking about this for 5 or 10 years, probably doing some work already themselves, but we'll be working with stakeholders who are having the conversation for the very first time, not understanding sometimes their own personal biases and biases that can exist in the workplace. And so I find a lot of our kind of early engagement is education and explaining those lived experiences, because it can be so hard for people. So imagining a woman who's maybe a senior executive, for example, in an engineering company, she might be the only one. And so whenever she's explaining those experiences, they're her experiences, even though she knows that many other people are experiencing them, but it's easy to dismiss that as, well, maybe this is just one person's experience. So I think sometimes for us, coming in as a third party is really helpful, because we can share, here's all the statistics, all the information that we know that this is happening in many situations, and we can help you. And I think that tends to break it down and make it a little bit more accessible.
What kind of transformational change have you seen, either maybe we separate these two conversations between, the workplaces or the employers per se and individuals, but maybe on the employer side, what changes have you seen that you've been, directly impacting throughout the work that you do?
Yeah, I think I get really excited when I see people suddenly wanting to really champion these initiatives. I think a common challenge that we hear, and I think this is really prevalent in engineering, tech, and construction, it's a very analytical fields in many ways, where we get pushback because of the concept of meritocracy. So we want to hire the best person for the role, which of course everyone wants to hire the best person for the role, but the challenge is meritocracy doesn't take into account personal biases. And so how we all define the best person for a position could be very biased, and typically is, especially if we're not aware of those biases. So if we're a really uniform leadership team trying to select the next executive to promote, we're much more likely to promote someone who is like us. And so there was a really cool study in the book Invisible Women, which is just sharing gender bias gaps in many different industries and parts of society. And what they shared is that a belief in meritocracy led to less objective decision making. And so in the study, they found that men who believed in their own personal objectivity were more likely to hire a male candidate than an identically described female candidate. So it's sort of ironic that the belief in meritocracy actually led to less objective decision making. And so I think when we see people come around from that, of both acknowledging it's not some people are biased and others aren't, everyone's biased, we just need to build awareness about them so we can confront them, and that we can achieve equity, diversity, and inclusion while hiring the best person for the role. And it's sometimes the way we're evaluating people that's actually the problem. And so we can create objective evaluation criteria, and we can create panels of individuals who are responsible for making that decision. And we can create submissions for that criteria where everyone's submitting their perspectives independently without being biased by hearing someone else's perspective. So all these small steps that can actually allow them to hire the best person that they might have been looking over before. So I think on that side, that's my favorite part, is hearing people get excited about that concept and realizing, you know, you can have your cake and eat it too.
Love it. Who doesn't want to do that?
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. How does one become aware of these biases that exist that maybe they're not aware of, you know, or maybe they're hidden biases, or you used a better term than I did, but you know, how do we work on becoming aware of these, and I imagine that's the first step to fixing them.
Definitely. I like starting with the Harvard Implicit Association test, and so each test is about 5 minutes long. And there's different ones for gender biases and for sexual orientation and different biases. And so you can do the test, and it will basically show you a series of images in different orders, and you categorize that. And so it's really your subconscious that is making those decisions, because you want to move through it really quickly. But you might be creating positive associations with certain individuals and then negative associations with others. And I think it's such a great starting point. Like, I know when I did it, I had a very strong association with men and STEM careers, which is so ironic because I'd spent my whole career as an engineer advocating for women to be represented. And so obviously I'm holding on to this bias. So when I think about if I was a senior leader at an engineering firm, would I be favoring men in who might get that promotion or be hired for that role? So I think starting with that can be great, and you can see kind of where your key biases start to present. And then as you build an understanding, you can start catching yourself of, you know, if you are evaluating someone in their performance review, trying to sleep on it and then come back to it and challenge, like, why did I put that recommendation forward for that person? Was it because I just had a feeling, or is it because they delivered at this level on this project deliverable, and this is a key scoring criteria for us? And so trying to differentiate kind of a gut feel versus what someone's actually delivering.
Right. So it's awareness and education, really.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm. The work that you do with these employers, is it a lot of like consulting kind of based work, or is there, you know, and you mentioned building out these criteria and these evaluations and that sort of thing. Is it one size fits all, or do you find that there's lots of customization needed for different businesses that you work with?
We tend to follow a lot of customization. So we have kind of key service offerings. So maybe we're doing an equity, diversity, and inclusion health check and action plan, or we're helping someone implement an employee resource group. But we tend to provide quite a bit of customization, both to, you know, speak to, we like to be very purpose-driven. And so we want to make sure that we're aligned with exactly what they're trying to achieve from this initiative. Like, are they very focused on increasing representation of certain identities at particular levels, or are they trying to increase their engagement because they have had higher rates of turnover, for example? So really trying to tailor to that perspective, but also we like to tailor to who that company is, how socially engaged are they? Are they having a bunch of social events throughout the year? Are they more remote work? Are they more site-based and in-office? And they have a bunch of different regions. So making sure that anything we're recommending is really tailored to their specific needs and their specific company. So we often find we might be working with two companies that are direct competitors. They operate in the same regions, and our recommendations are varied because they have specific needs.
Interesting. Awesome. Does your work expand beyond, like, what are the, do you work with North America wide? What are the kind of parameters of the work that you do?
Yeah, so on our employer side, typically we're working in Canada and the US. We'd love in the future to expand beyond that as well. And then on our compensation negotiation side and workshops, we do Canada, the US, and then the UK as well. We find the compensation structures in general are more similar within those regions, but again, with that, we'd also love to continue to expand.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's the employer side. Now on the individual side, how do you go about? Is it individuals that come to you for this consulting work? How do you find your customers?
Yeah, so mostly individuals coming to us, and we find a lot are from client referrals. So a lot of past clients recommending our services, which is great. We have a lot of, high client satisfaction from people we work with. It's so interesting. Like when we started out, I think, we weren't sure what everyone's level of comfort with compensation was going to be. And we also thought, because when we bring on a new client, we go through every element of their compensation package. So there's a big piece of education around that. So base salary, bonus and equity, but also professional development allowance, tech allowance, all those other pieces, and then help to identify any of those that look low from a market perspective. So when we started, we thought that would be, such a strong focus, and it definitely is, but I think almost a bigger piece, or at least a 50-50 split, is the comfort around asking and helping someone articulate their strengths in a way that they feel really comfortable. Sometimes we work with C-suite executives that they are negotiating massive portfolios for their companies, and they've never negotiated for themselves. And I think there is such a discomfort in negotiating, especially for women. And so, yeah, we do find a lot of our clients that we get from past client referrals who are just really excited that they felt confident going into a conversation that was otherwise very nerve-wracking to them. And then another piece as well, because we do a lot of workshops for professional groups and women's organizations, a lot of those are on the topic of compensation negotiation. So we do end up getting quite a few clients from those past sessions as well, once they have that awareness that that's something they could get support from.
Definitely. I imagine that helping somebody negotiate would actually not only change their experience, but also probably the organization's outlook on fair compensation as well. Is that true?
I totally think so, because as well, like from the education side around compensation as well, we hear a lot of confusion around how to center, like someone to center their ask. And so a lot of times we see pitfalls of someone wanting to bring up market data, which can be relevant, but often it isn't. Maybe I'm working at a small tech startup in Vancouver and I'm bringing in a market data point from Microsoft, and it's just, those are very different organizations, different sizes, different compensation philosophies. So helping those individuals instead focus on, this is the impact that I'm delivering in this role. So that helps both build their own confidence, but also an understanding of, what else might be expected in this role? How can I continue to grow? So I think that can help get more alignment between leaders and individuals from compensation expectations. And then as well, just normalizing the ask. We hear so many people that leave companies because they're too afraid to negotiate and feel it's more comfortable for me to leave and negotiate in a new role, even though I might not have necessarily wanted to leave that role. So I think everyone wins, the organization wins, if that person is at least able to feel comfortable being open and saying, hey, this is where I'm at, maybe it doesn't always mean that their employer can meet them exactly where they're asking for, but at least it can set themselves up to get there in the future, or identify any gaps in their performance or expertise that they could close to get there. So I think organizations really benefit from that as well. And it's interesting, because we do workshops for employers as well, we're typically, those often are more focused on equity, diversity, and inclusion topics, but more and more we're having employers reach out and ask us to do compensation negotiation sessions for their teams, because they recognize that they benefit if their teams are comfortable negotiating and if they are comfortable understanding that budgets are real, and that if they want to ask for that raise, they might need to bring it up in October, even though performance review season is in February, so that they can build that into their budget. So I think everyone's really benefiting from those conversations.
Definitely. It's cool to hear about these unexpected benefits. When you're building a business, you have kind of your objectives in mind and what you're going to impact, but these other things that you might not have been able to foresee are also happening as a result, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really exciting to see that positive change starting to happen.
Definitely. Is this a service that you wish you had when you were, a full-time engineer?
Yes. I can picture 2 negotiations that really come to mind where I just fell apart so quickly. It was so nervous, and I also felt so much that I had that disconnect between I couldn't recognize I was providing impact as well, and I was just asking for compensation that would align with that impact. And just, recognizing the ability, a no might be a no right now, but it doesn't have to be a no forever, or even holding to your number. I think I can picture one conversation specifically where I did all of this prep. I felt really good. I'd been nervous about negotiations in the past, so I'd taken that time. I went in, put my ask forward, and got a no, and I just said, okay, and then took whatever they said. And I realize now I could have said, I've taken a lot of time to prepare, and I feel really good about what I'm putting forward because of X, Y, Z. This is what I've done this year. This is what I've delivered. Could we, reconnect at the end of the week to continue chatting about it? And now I see so often when people do hold to their numbers, again, it doesn't always mean that you get a match exactly with what you put forward, but we see people getting closer to that number. So not always accepting a no, or recognizing you don't always have to respond in the moment as well. So I definitely would have benefited from this.
How important is confidence in those conversations?
I think it comes into a big play. I find often towards the end of a coaching session, something that comes up often is, should I have this conversation in person? Could I maybe just send an email? And I think people want to send the email, especially we find people who are kind of more mid-career and earlier, because it's so much more comfortable, because they're nervous and they don't want to get nervous and lose confidence in the conversation. But tone is often lost in text. So we find that it's better to have the conversation either virtually, in person, or over the phone, so you can have a little bit of that tone. Otherwise, it can sometimes come off as you're asking for this sort of checklist of information. It doesn't mean a follow-up can't be done via email, but in terms of building that confidence, I think the practice is a big part of it, like practicing in front of a mirror, or practicing in front of a friend, family member, or coach, and feeling really good about what you're going to say. And then another piece I think that makes people lose confidence is the fear of getting thrown off by a question. So if there's pushback that they weren't expecting, or they're asked about something that they weren't prepped for. So we always like to do scenario testing beforehand, so you can think through how you might respond to different situations. What if your leader says, well, there's no budget right now? How would you respond to that? Or what if they say you need to kind of grow your expertise in a particular area? What would you say to that? And so then it limits the chance that you have more of an emotional reaction during that conversation. And then always knowing as a fallback, you can say, I do want to think a little bit more about that. Could we reconnect at the end of the week, feeling that you don't need to always respond to everything real time if you're not feeling prepped for that particular question.
Yeah, 100%. I imagine that these skills that you're teaching or coaching on are they're translatable to so many other aspects of life too, right?
Definitely. Yeah, like giving yourself that space. Like I think people get so afraid of reacting emotionally to things. And of course it makes sense. Your compensation is so important and it is an emotional conversation and emotions are great. I don't think we need to minimize those, but we often don't want to have them real time in front of someone in the middle of a negotiation. So I think it can be really helpful even for talking about something else that you're nervous about at work or in your personal life.
Definitely. Where do you personally get your fulfillment from the work that you do?
I think that like almost in two different ways from like each of our kind of main services. I think I get a lot of personal fulfillment from helping someone negotiate for compensation, feeling that they were really nervous, maybe they were feeling undervalued and they weren't able to articulate in a concise way all of the impact that they were delivering, or they were feeling that they were going to have to change jobs to get a boost even though they really loved their team and wanted to continue working there. And I love nothing more than getting those emails of I asked, they matched what I asked for. I'm so excited. And now that person is really excited to continue with their next project. They're feeling so much more engaged and connected at work, which I think is so powerful, and just happier at work. Being happy at work is so important. And I think on the employer side, it's that ability to make more of that sustained change. I do get very excited when we're working with employers that maybe historically are in industries that are, traditionally not investing a lot in people and culture initiatives and are now recognizing the value to do that and are really excited about the opportunity to create better senses of community and belonging at their work. And you just know that when those leaders are so invested in that, then all of their workforce is going to benefit from that as well. So I think that's really exciting too, because we spend a lot of time at work and it's important to be able to enjoy that and feel really good about it.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. It's the work that you're doing is so, I can't imagine, like, what kind of challenges do you deal with when trying to do the work that you do?
Yeah, I think, a hard part for sure is meeting people where they're at. Like a big thing of what we like to do, and partly why we focus on engineering, construction, and tech as well, is I remember when I was in engineering and we would sometimes hire external consultants for equity, diversity, and inclusion, I would be so aligned with the recommendations they were making, but they were so progressive for the industry, and there was so much discomfort from many of our team members with what was being recommended. And so I really like to focus on meeting people where they're at. Like equity, diversity, and inclusion is a journey. People aren't going to achieve it overnight, and I don't think that expectation should be there. I also continue learning, and I spend a lot of my day thinking about it. So I think helping people break down that fear, I think some people are avoidant to talk about it, discuss it, put any effort or action in because they're so afraid of saying the wrong thing that they can't enter a conversation. So I think the hardest part sometimes is establishing that open environment where we set the stage that this is going to be an open conversation. People are allowed to share their perspectives, acknowledge everyone's going to be in a different point in their journey, and the point is to receive that information with openness, and for that person to also be able to receive open feedback on how someone else might perceive that perspective. And I think that is, the most important starting point, because if you can't have that conversation, I don't think you can do anything else.
Do you ever experience any sort of like pushback or anything like that, either from an organization or an individual?
Yeah, sometimes. From the organizational side, I think it's hard when people are at a very different level, and this has come up in a couple of different conversations where someone might feel very confident to say, maybe women are just not good engineers, and there's people around them that I'm thinking, oh, this is very hard for you to hear because you're a colleague or a peer of this person and you identify as a woman in this space. And then we have to be the people that are kind of diffusing that situation and helping to educate them, which I think for me personally is really exciting to do, because I remember when I was working as an engineer, like that would be a really devastating comment. And of course it still is, but it's less personally devastating because I'm on the outside. So we do hear that, and I feel like a lot of it, that is where that meritocracy conversation comes up a lot. But I find the biggest help in those conversations is approaching with curiosity. Like if I challenge that, that person instantly gets defensive and they tend to shut me out. But if I say my perspective and saying, well, you know, for these reasons, I don't believe that's the case, and I believe that why someone might think that might be tied to personal biases, but then giving them an opportunity to say, you know, I'm curious of where you might have observed that in the past, and could you share more details of, you know, where that perspective is coming from. And I find sometimes using that approach, someone realizes they actually don't have any rationale for that comment. They just had a feeling and felt that they could share that. And it's almost, you don't really have to do as much then, because they kind of talk themselves out of it by themselves as long as you give them the space. So I find that's often kind of the biggest family of challenges that we're dealing with. But I do find it kind of exciting to, like, it feels like such a win when you are able to get that person to a place where they're more open to investing in those initiatives.
It sounds like a lot of the work that you do is very people oriented, obviously, right? Like, but you're consulting, you're coaching, you're convincing, you're doing working, not convincing, but you're doing workshops and that sort of thing. Was interacting with people always a strength of yours, or has that been learned?
Yeah, I actually think so. I worked through high school, university, and then a little bit after, I worked at a restaurant as a hostess and then as a server. And I think that, of course, my engineering degree was very important to be a structural engineer. But when I was a structural engineer, I worked in consulting. And so a big part of my role was also negotiating with clients. It was explaining complex concepts to people. It was often dealing with highly stressful situations for budget or for schedule and trying to get people on board. And I think my experience in the restaurant industry or in hospitality was the most critical learning experience of my whole career, because especially as someone, I was probably more on the introverted side, definitely very shy. But in that industry, you have to talk to new people every day. You sometimes are talking to people who are having a bad day and have decided they want to blame their server for that. And so you're almost, you know, dealing with someone who's having an adult tantrum and trying to blame that on their salad. And I found it really helpful, like that, I think. So I would say, yeah, to answer your question, I don't think it was innate in something that I had, because I think I was very shy. But I think that experience was what built that skill. And I felt so much more confident when I was in engineering consulting. And I remember one of my leaders early on saying, you know, before I even had my license as an engineer, I was still an engineer in training. He said he felt confident to put me in the room with their top clients because I was always able to kind of diffuse situations, get people on board, and be solution oriented. I think that all came from working in restaurants.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, those are the hardest situations to deal with, right? So if you can do it there, you can do it anywhere.
Definitely.
Yeah, awesome. It's interesting to hear. You know, I feel like lots of entrepreneurs are not risk averse. They're like super risky risk takers and that sort of thing. And I'm curious, not to say that there's a right or wrong by any means, but how do you think that kind of mentality of being risk averse affects your business?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I actually find both my business partner Jill and I are quite risk averse. And I think that's led to us making conservative in some situations, decisions, but also really bootstrapping. And I think that allowed us a lot of early success. I think we spoke to so many people early on when we were just trying to test our idea who were encouraging us to make these big spends, and we wanted to make sure we felt really good about what we were putting out there first. We did everything in a lot of small steps, but I think that allowed us to have a lot of early success. I mean, of course, there are those unicorns that, blow up really quickly, but a lot of times there's also businesses that aren't successful. And so you could have been in a situation where you put a ton of money into something that didn't end up panning out in that same way. And so I think it was really exciting for us because we were able to have this really sustained growth. And we're in business now for 3 years. We've been profitable since the first year and have had year-over-year growth each year, which has been really exciting. Even this year, we weren't sure what would happen. We knew we were in a pretty tough economic environment, especially because a lot of our clients are in engineering, construction, and tech, which we're all really struggling this year, especially at the beginning of the year. And, being able to have that continued success. So I think our risk-averse mentality made us successful in what we do. So again, of course, there's no right way or wrong way, but it worked really well for us.
Yeah, I think that it's a common theme on this topic, on this podcast, whether people should go for funding right away or come up with the idea first, or how to go about that. And I think bootstrapping is one of those things that really teaches you a lot.
Definitely.
Yeah, and you approach things differently because of it.
I think so, and for us too, I don't think we could name it at the beginning because early on we explored opportunities for funding and growing at that more accelerated rate, but then we feared loss of autonomy and control. Like that was so much of what gave us personal fulfillment in our day-to-day role. And so I'm so glad we didn't jump into that route before we'd thought about it more, because we would have lost control in some ways. And it doesn't mean it couldn't be successful in a different way, but that was something that was really driving us, was autonomy. And so we were able to build exactly what we wanted. And it's not to say we might not make a different choice down the road in a few years, but at least we've built the core foundation where that's been established before we're bringing in those external perspectives. And we can feel really good about that. Whereas if we'd brought someone in earlier on, there would have been a lot more room for flexibility in the way someone might have wanted to push us in certain directions.
Definitely. And things change, right? Like you need to learn, you need to be able to adapt and move quickly and not be hard fast in a certain way, especially at the beginning.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. It allowed us to make very efficient decisions because it was really just the two of us. We didn't have to report to anyone. And it allowed us to be really adaptable. I mean, even a really interesting piece early on is we never intended to do workshops and presentations, and people just kept asking us about it. So we slowly over time crafted a full service offering, which is now about 40% of our revenue, which is really interesting because that wasn't initially our intention. But I think the autonomy that we had and that flexibility allowed us to say, well, that's what people are responding to, so let's follow that.
Yeah, awesome. There's so many individuals who are maybe in a corporate role right now, or are doing something and they're thinking about, taking the step into entrepreneurship. Maybe they have an idea or they want to explore something different. I'm curious, what I guess made you take that first step and decide that this is what you wanted to do and dive, headfirst into it?
Yeah, I feel like it was almost like a multi-staged process. I remember before Jill and I had talked about the Thoughtful Co, and I think before she'd left her previous role, I had been looking at all of these different roles that would maybe fit. And I remember saying, I couldn't find exactly what I wanted to do. And I remember saying to my partner, in 2 years, I'm going to have my own business. I just don't know what it is. And so I think it was just a feeling maybe of that I really wanted to do work in a particular area, but I couldn't find a role that fit what I wanted to do. So I felt that I had to create it. And then in terms of actually making the push to go full-time, we did a slow transition so Jill had already left, she was full-time from the beginning, and then it was almost a year later that I joined full-time, so I was still working, and I found it very difficult to figure out when to make the jump, and it's a pretty emotional decision, and it's hard to figure out, when do I feel comfortable financially for my family, financially for the business, like what will make me feel comfortable. And I remember kind of in the spring of that year, I made a list of constraints to myself, which were basically, increasing my personal emergency fund, so investing less and keeping more cash, and I set a minimum average revenue over the past previous months so I could feel comfortable. I knew, I'm not going to necessarily make what I made in my past role, but what do I feel comfortable with? And then I also set some parameters around upcoming projected revenue and, our kind of past income. And so then once I had all of those constraints written down, it became less stressful because I knew, I just have to meet these constraints and then I go, versus I don't know when I go. And then once the time came that I hit all of those check marks, it felt easy to make the decision. Whereas I think if I hadn't written that down, it would have felt a lot scarier because it's just so unknown, exactly. But I had, made that agreement to myself. And the other piece I said as well was, this is still successful even if I try doing it for 6 months and it doesn't pan out. I'm still proud of myself for trying. And I think that alleviated some of the pressure as well. Like, that's still amazing to take a plunge and try it, and maybe it doesn't pan out. I'm very thankful it did. That was definitely the outcome I was hoping for. But I think giving myself that space, that it's still a win to put yourself out there and try. That's not a failure. So I think when I had that kind of mentality and those constraints, it made it so much easier to go for it.
The engineering brain that made you, put all these constraints down and be like, this is what I need to do.
Yeah, I think that really helped. Having it written down, there was rules, it was structured, made it easier.
Yeah. Were there other elements that you pulled from or maybe learned throughout your years in engineering that you've applied in your business now that have been invaluable in its success?
Yeah, I think the kind of like analytical metrics side, like we really like to, when we're working with employers as well, try and help them define specific targets and measurements so that they're not just investing time and resources into these initiatives, they know if they're achieving a specific purpose and how effectively they are. And I think a lot of that comes from my engineering background and Jill's as well, coming from compensation, very analytical as well. And then I think also in some ways to my approach to my business strategy, I think engineering's played a lot of a role in that as well, both in terms of being very structured and creating procedures wherever possible. Like I remember in consulting, there was so much benefit in time efficiency in creating a structure for how you do really common tasks and procedures where they add value. So really trying to implement that process as well in our business has been successful. And I think there's probably some of the risk-averse piece that comes from engineering too. You don't want to be too risky as a structural engineer, so I'm sure that is aligning with that side.
Some level of certainty is probably pretty important in that line
exactly.
of work. Yeah. Being a business owner, an entrepreneur, a founder is extremely hard, and there's days where everybody kind of questions whether they're doing the right thing. Have you experienced any of those days?
Yeah, definitely. Like what I found early on, especially, and like I still experience this now, it's just I experience it in a slightly different way, is, I went from such a predictable role in so many ways. Of course, there were busy times of the year and less busy, but everything was quite secure and predictable and routine. And then all of a sudden, as a business owner, you were personally so much more susceptible to changes in the market environment and to busier times. And sometimes you put something out there that you thought would be a huge hit and it's not. And I remember one of our like first early contracts that we did ultimately sign it, but it was at the stage where I think we just sent them the contract to sign it. And I was like so over the moon, was so excited. And I remember my partner just responding, being like, "Oh, that's good. Yeah, that's nice." And I was like, "How dare you?" I was so excited about this. Like, you need to bring up the energy. And he was like, "Well, one, do you have ink on paper? Have they signed it?" And I was like, "No, they haven't signed it." And he said, two, like, I think he was like, "This is a great, moment, but you're going to have some low moments. Like, entrepreneurship is going to be more like this when you're used to this." And so he said, he was kind of saying, it's not that you shouldn't celebrate the wins. You absolutely should celebrate the wins. Just kind of try to stay more in the middle when you can. And I think that was a really good perspective of, yeah, of course you always want to celebrate and take stock of your wins, but you almost can't let yourself get too high because you become more susceptible to getting too low as well when something doesn't pan out, and it's inherently going to. And so now I feel like I almost respond in a very similar way to wins and losses, in that it's like a win is, okay, well, what's the next win? Excited about that. That was amazing. And a loss is, okay, what's going to be the next win then? And I think that approach has really helped to manage that uncertainty, because I found it kind of hard in the beginning because it was just so different from what I was used to.
Totally. Do you think that management of those like swings, if you will, or roller coaster, whatever you want to call it, almost makes us a little bit numb to potential wins or successes or things like that outside of business?
Yeah, that's interesting. Cause I think it is so important still to like take stock of your wins. And I think in some ways it can, but yeah, I think always just trying to, be grateful, but don't be controlled fully by a win or loss. Like, it doesn't define that day or that moment. Good things are going to happen in life and bad things are going to happen. So you want to be grateful of the good things, but they don't need to totally take over, if that makes sense, because then you become more at risk, I think, of, that sort of feeling really low when something doesn't work out. And one thing I do like is that Jill and I, we in our just like weekly kind of general meeting, we start every meeting with a win from last week. And so just sharing something that we're really excited about. And some weeks those wins are really big and some weeks they're not as exciting, but it's still taking a moment to say, that's something that I'm really grateful for last week.
So important. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How important is finding the right business partner?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because I always laugh. Like, I remember early on when we were still more developing the concept. And so we were, at that time especially, soliciting a lot of advice from different people. And we got so many comments around people sharing how to pick the right business partner and how to make sure you're aligned. And I think it is so important to be thoughtful about that. But ironically, I feel like that's the one thing that we weren't necessarily intentional about. Like, we knew each other, but not super well before we started. And we worked so well together. And I feel like in many ways, we just really lucked out. And we've heard the horror stories of, partnerships that don't work out. And so most of the time, I just remember us ending some of those calls being like, wow, we're so lucky that this just worked out. I wouldn't probably recommend people to be so laissez-faire. For us, it worked out amazing. And maybe there's some innate thing that happened and behind the scenes, and subconsciously we were, evaluating that more. But I think it is so important, like you want to be value aligned and purpose aligned. So making sure that you're both trying to achieve the same things, but you also don't want to be the same person. And so having varied strengths and weaknesses. Like, I think, for example, I am very visual and I really like organizing and formatting the way that we're presenting information. So if we're creating, an employee handbook for an employee resource group, for example, and, I might have spent a lot of time creating the content, but I will miss typos and little things like that. I'm not detail oriented in that way. And Jill is so detail oriented, and it's amazing because she can just finesse it so well. And if we were both one of those things, all our work would be slightly less good. So I think like finding ways where you complement each other, but you have to also be kind of fundamentally aligned.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever had any sort of conflict or, rubbing of feathers or anything like that, where you've had to kind of resolute conflict? What do you call it?
Yeah.
Conflict resolution. That's what I'm looking for.
Honestly, we haven't really. And I think part of that is we're both pretty preventative and communicative. So generally, if something's on either of our minds, we're gonna share it. And we are communicating so regularly. So I feel like that's been a really big benefit for us, because I'm sure there are things that have happened that could have led to conflicts, but because we were talking about them when they were just an idea or a concept, it never got to that point. And so I think a big part of it is not letting something stew. And obviously you want to be thoughtful and like take something away. If you're annoyed by something, think about why you're annoyed. Do you actually want to bring it up? Is it important? Is it meaningful? But if you do feel like it's meaningful, then bring that up and then figure out a path forward. And I think that's been really helpful to us, because we tend to always do that. And I feel like we always are able to then get on the same page.
How do you go about marketing the work that you do?
Yeah, that's been, before we were really bootstrapping. And one of my, greatest learnings is like, go to the experts, because the experts are better at it. And so we were, marketing, quote unquote, which was me creating various things in Canva. I think we did well for our lack of experience in that area, in building our brand. And then, was it beginning of last year, beginning of this year, we were connected with someone who was helping us with our marketing strategy. So she was one of the first contractors we brought on, and has been so amazing. And I feel like we spent one call and we're like, oh, we're not marketing, you're marketing. You're doing something different than what we're doing. And so that was really amazing. But yeah, so we've done a lot, like on our employer side, we haven't really done a lot of kind of like ads, I would say, and that type of thing. Like so much of our business development is personal relationships and networking. Over time, the more kind of big names that we've worked with and the more testimonials we've had, we now get a lot more outreach from people finding us, which has been amazing, especially for us to be able to expand into other regions and to work more with the US, for example. And then on our individual level as well, I think a lot is we post a lot of, educational content, and then people start to become aware that that's something that they can get support with, which is really helpful. And then another piece is I'm honestly surprised that we kept up with it, but we still do our blogs that we started out 3 years ago. And so we just take turns and we'll just write about things. They're often related to our work in some way or some recent experience we've had at work, and we share tips and strategies. And I think that's been really helpful for us, because it's a big draw for people to get some sort of fundamental information and then also learn a little bit more about what we do.
That's good for you, because blogs are typically the first thing to be forgotten.
I know.
Speaking from experience.
Yeah, we are honestly shocked every day that we continue to write them. Even I'm going on parental leave in a few months, and I've already written most of my articles for my leave, and I'm surprised at myself. That would have been an easy thing to say, I'm just not going to do that. Yeah. But we were like, no, I like it. We're just going to keep it going.
Awesome. In the space that you're in, is there a lot of I don't even want to call it competition, because at the end of the day, you're all doing great work, right? And you're pushing each other up and making a difference ultimately. But is there competition in your space?
Yeah, there is. It's kind of an interesting area, because at least on our individual side, there's a lot of executive coaches and some of those do negotiation. It's typically not kind of a core service offering. It tends to come up as part of something else that they're doing. But in terms of people or companies that are directly offering compensation negotiation, there's very few. So that piece has been really exciting, but it also leads to a big part of education for us. So a lot of our marketing is around education to the consumer that there is an opportunity to get coaching in this specific area. And sometimes we will work with executive coaches where we might do referral agreements as well, because we don't offer that type of coaching ourselves. And so it's great to be able to support people that we're aligned with. And then on the equity, diversity, and inclusion side and our employer work, there's definitely, quite a few different companies and organizations that are offering support in that space. And, we're relatively niche. Like we decided earlier on, we wanted to specialize a little bit in terms of industry, just because I felt that industry was kind of left behind in some ways. And so, yeah, I think I always like that. I think competitors are good because it means you're doing something that other people have identified as valuable as well. And it's great because I find it is a pretty supportive community. Like we have really good relationships with other individuals who are offering services that are similar in some ways or collaborative. And, I really like that part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking there must be a lot more collaboration than competition as per standardized terms. Like there's just the fact that everybody probably wants your service benefits mine, and we can go in here collectively and help raise the business bottom line from a social good perspective.
Exactly. And one thing that's exciting too is that, we don't do specifically compensation consulting, for example, but that comes up as part of our work a lot. And there's some great businesses out there that do pay equity audits. And so it's great to have relationships with them to bring them in where it's relevant and, get the experts to do what the experts do. But it's so related to the work that we do as well.
Throughout the 3 years that you've been building the business, are there any insights or experiences that you've had that have led to a learning that you wish you knew when you started?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like it's been a continued learning, all the time. I think, key words that jump out at us a lot, especially as we were building and, navigating different years, is adaptability and resilience and just following where the work is. Don't push something if people aren't responding to it. And so I think now, I remember us launching one program that just really didn't have the uptake that we thought it would, but we really didn't do a lot of market testing and we didn't do a lot of feedback solicitation. And so now when we are launching something, we get so much information and we spend a lot more time in that development stage of trying to figure out, is this worth it? How do we want to structure it? And so I think that is a really exciting part about what we do now that I wish we'd done better before.
Yeah. What does success look like to you?
Ooh, that's a big question. I think, and I've said this a little bit already, but I think autonomy is a big part. I would love us to be the source in the future of gender equity data and pay equity data. I think we have a lot of great compensation data now and are building a better understanding of the gender pay gap. And I want to build that understanding because right now we hear a lot of numbers about the gender pay gap, but it's typically grouped together by a bunch of different levels. It doesn't often take into account intersectionality. There's reports that do, but it's also missing a lot of information. And I want to become the market data source for a strong understanding of pay equity. And so I think, leaning on those pieces, I think that social advocacy is a big part of it. I want us to be able to have made a significant reduction in the gender pay gap and to increase representation of underrepresented groups in engineering, construction, and tech, and build more inclusive and engaging spaces. I think success looks like those organizations as retaining more individuals and having better employee experiences, and that would give me a lot of personal fulfillment.
Having that data hub, was that something that was kind of in the back of your mind at the beginning of starting the business 3 years ago, or has it kind of evolved to that and now you're like, hey, there's this other opportunity that I didn't even foresee back then?
Yeah, so that's actually something that's slowly built over time. Like, we thought about it very early on, but it just felt like such a faraway concept. And now we're in the process of launching a new product where, like, we acknowledge that not everyone is going to be able to pay for a coach to go into a compensation negotiation. And so how can we make our services more accessible to women of all wealth experiences? And additionally, how can we give people that basic understanding of where they're sitting from a market perspective? And there are some resources out there. There are some compensation reports. There's also things like PayScale and Glassdoor, but they tend to aggregate cash compensation together, and they don't tend to provide information on all of those other important pieces. And then a lot of them are also employer funded, so there's some inherent bias in that. So we are looking to launch a new platform where individuals can enter all of their compensation data, and this would also be open to all genders as well, because we don't want our data to be biased. And then there would be an optional section to enter identity information about race or ethnicity or gender, so we can get a better understanding of the pay gap in different groups. And then individuals would then get a customized report of, I am a senior engineer in Vancouver at a medium-sized company, and this is where I'm sitting in all of these different categories. And so I'm really excited about that opportunity, both on empowering individuals who might not be able to access a coach, for example, so giving them some of that information to help them negotiate, and then also getting a better understanding of what those gaps really are.
Incredible. Is that something that's already in the works or an idea at this point?
It's already in the works, and so we're hoping to have a launch at the end of this year of our kind of minimum, like our kind of early stage pilot version, and then a full launch next year. So that we're both really excited about that right now.
No doubt. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Do you have any competitors in that space, or is this kind of a first to market?
There are some competitors in the space, which, honestly, again, is good. It means that people are interested. No one that we've come across that's doing it from the pay equity lens, more just on individual information. So that's sort of like one category. And then on the other side as well, there's a lot that are very basic and they're just giving you information on salary and bonus, or they are funded by employers, so inherently biased in that way. So we really want everything tied to information on biases, understanding the gender pay gap and the pay gap more broadly from an intersectional lens. And so having that is really the key goal of the project as well.
Incredible. Can't wait to see it.
Yeah, I'm really excited.
Do you experience, having all these ideas and like so many different directions to go with where you could be and what you want to do in the future, whether it be related or unrelated to what you do currently, or are you kind of hyper-focused on what you're doing and the impact that you have currently?
Yeah, I would say like hyper-focused on kind of what we're achieving as a business, but then within that, many different ideas that come up. I think we've gotten better over time at, how are we prioritizing? Where are we really excited? What's really driving our mission? And it's okay to not focus on the other things now. It doesn't mean we're never going to do them, but we're not going to focus on them right now. Because I think, actually going back on your other question, that's probably another area of learning as well is, your most valuable resource is time. And there's typically infinite ways that you could spend that time and many different projects you could be working on. And so trying to focus on what do we need to get done this week and, over this month and this quarter, what are the things we want to do, what's less important, And then that can make it so much easier to say yes and no to things that provide value or drive that mission forward, and when to say, you know what, I don't have capacity for that, but we can do that next summer. And that's been really helpful because it is very tempting to work on all of those different things.
100%, yeah. I mean, prioritization becomes number one there, right? Because if you don't have anything prioritized, then you're spending all your time doing all these different things but then nothing amasses from any of it, right? So
exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. So you explained a little bit about the new product, which is incredible. Is there anything else that's coming up? What's down the line for you personally?
Yeah, so I think that's our big focus right now. And then we do want to continue to grow, especially on our employer side too. I mean, we are two white women, so we would love to grow our team in the future to have more diverse lived experiences. Right now, our strategy when we are consulting in spaces that we don't feel comfortable in terms of our own lived experience, then we would reach out to contractors. But we love to build our team in the future so we can speak more to that intersectional lens. And so I think that would be, that's a really exciting goal for us on the horizon, to start building our team more as well.
Awesome. For teams or individuals or businesses that are looking to ensure that they have diversity on their teams and they're inclusive all around and those sort of things, what advice would you have? You gave some great advice earlier about kind of, ensuring that you're aware of your biases and that sort of thing, but is there anything that, is a quick shift or that everybody should be thinking about when they're hiring or anything like that?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I would recommend is getting an understanding of current representation, because sometimes we might perceive that we know where our gaps are, but actually looking at numbers is really helpful. Of course, there are challenges with that with certain identities in terms of everything needs to be self-reported, and not everyone might be comfortable disclosing. But I even find just self-reporting and measuring rates of self-reporting is a great metric to begin with. Really, if you're starting out this work, watching that number increase over time is an indication that people are likely more comfortable reporting on their identity and likely feeling a little bit more engaged and included at work. The people who are typically not comfortable aren't feeling comfortable as themselves at work, or have other reasons that they're not comfortable participating in those initiatives. So I think measurement is the perfect starting point, and then hopefully through that you can start to see where your gaps exist. Do you have a low representation at a senior leadership level of a particular identity, or there's a strong majority in that group? And do you have different rates of retention for different identities at that level? Or is there differences in the number of people who are being promoted? So kind of looking through the pipeline to see at what point that challenge is starting. And then, so I think starting with data is the perfect point, so you can see, where are the problems? And maybe there's a little bit of a problem in every area, but there's typically some more pronounced ones. So you can be a little bit more focused on, okay, if that really is my challenge at a senior leadership level, I'm maybe going to stop focusing on going to job fairs at a university level. I'm going to focus on my senior level recruiting and my succession planning initiatives and the way we're evaluating people for promotions at that level. So I think, and it doesn't mean you have to stop any recruitment initiatives, but you might put more effort into that for those first few years to help correct that gap. So I think data is the best place to start, and then you can identify where are the problems and at what point is it becoming a problem.
I think that's such great advice, because that data already exists, right? You just have to look back at practices and find those patterns and ensure that you're actually analyzing it correctly.
Exactly, and I think that can be such a good starting point, because I think in the early point in that work, a lot of leaders and employers, they just feel so overwhelmed. They're like, I know we want to do something, but I have no idea where to start. And that's an accessible starting point. It's not a big change management concept yet. It's just collecting information, and then you can see, okay, where are we today? And now we can start defining where we might want to be a few years down the road.
Perfect. Where can we send people to follow along? Probably your blog, I imagine, and what's next for you, and where can we send people to follow along?
Yeah, so on our website, we post articles every 2 weeks, and people can also subscribe to our newsletter. So it's thethoughtfulco.net. And then we're also on Instagram at thethoughtful.co and LinkedIn at thethoughtfulco. And we do love to post all things that make us passionate about things around compensation, around the gender pay gap, and around equity, diversity, and inclusion in the workplace. And yeah, always love to hear from people as well, just hearing their own stories.
Awesome. Sophie, thank you so much for this conversation. I truly appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.